So today we have a hypothetical that hasn't been as explored as much as I would have liked by other people. Now, I don't know if others are as interested in this topic as I am, but I can barely find any videos relating to this topic anywhere on YouTube, which is a shame because it is an incredibly interesting question. So I've decided to answer it myself. Yep, you read the title correctly. In this video, we'll be exploring the question of whether one of the most infamous tools across anime can beat the One Punch Man himself. Basically an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, which would prevail. Now let me preface the video by saying that this is all an opinion from myself and is in no way a canonical answer nor a statement of authority. I'm just like you guys trying to answer a hypothetical question using reasonable logic and examples from within the two series we'll be analysing. Now of course, you're all entitled to disagree and I'd be glad to hear your thoughts on the topic, so yeah, let me know your theories. Now with that out of the way, let's get into one of the most important things we have to consider and abide by when coming up with an answer. The rules of the Death Note. Now the Death Note has strict rules that are stated within the manga and the anime as well as other canon books from the Death Note series, and we have a full list of them on the Death Note wiki with cited sources which I'll link below. But which of them apply to this hypothetical? Well, starting off with the first rule, it clearly states that the human whose name is written in this note shall die. Pretty straightforward, right? So applying this to the context of the One Punch Man verse, monsters like Garo and aliens like Boris wouldn't really be affected by the note. I mean, they're quite clearly not human. Now, here's where things get tricky. When it comes to Saitama, we know that he is a human, right? He possesses inhuman strength, so much so that he can sneeze away most of Jupiter, but I guess he still counts as a human. Is it really that simple? We know that these rules are quite clear-cut within the universe of Death Note, but outside of that, when you factor in beings like the likes of Saitama and Blast, who as far as we know are human, on the surface it doesn't really make sense for them to die. Now, there are some wild theories out there claiming that Saitama is not actually human and rather he has turned into some monster along his path, and they may have some merit as it does explain his inhuman power. And we've seen it happen before with monsters like Garo and Crablante, who originally were human, but their obsessions transformed them into monsters we know them as. Is this the case for Saitama too? I mean, we can't really tell that yet, but for the purpose of this video, let's set the baseline that he is a human as far as we know. So does that answer our question? Since he's human, the Death Note rules state that the human whose name is written will die, right? Now before we move on, we have to acknowledge that there are several other rules that grant immunity from the Death Note, such as misspelling a person's name 4 times. We're going to ignore these loopholes, because in this hypothetical, Saitama's name will be written down into the Death Note with a standard way of death, which is a heart attack. Now, at first it might seem quite straightforward, as the first rule basically outlines it, but we encounter our first problem right here, the name. Yeah, we don't know Saitama's full name, and nowhere is it mentioned in the series, and assuming that Saitama isn't his whole name, which in that case would be pretty straightforward. Now this won't really work in Death Note unless the Saitama that we know really doesn't have a second name. I mean, the user must write down the full version of their victim's name. This is a bit of a snag within our hypothetical, and a possible argument for why the Death Note won't actually work against the strongest hero. I mean, there isn't really a way to tell his full name, and we don't even know his parents to try and determine his real name. So is that it? Well, not exactly. Although this is a valid argument for why Saitama would prevail, it doesn't really answer our hypothetical question, since we want to pit the powers of inevitable death against the all-powerful being. So this isn't really a matchup between Light Yagami and Saitama, but more like the powers of the Death Note versus the One Punch Man. I mean, even if it was, a bloodlusted light can always take the Shinigami ideal to determine what to write down, and considering Saitama isn't the type to strike first, it could be plausible. So let's just assume we write down his full name. Whether it is Saitama or not, it doesn't really answer our question, so let's ignore the name problem for now. So how would it work? Could the One Punch Man really be defeated by the Death Note? A heart attack, also known as a myocardial infarction, is a biological phenomenon where the flow of blood that brings oxygen to your heart is blocked. Yeah, your heart muscle will die without the oxygen needed, but would it be enough to kill Saitama? Now here's the problem with the Death Note. It is a book that brings about inevitable death through means that kills any human being. Well, any normal one at least. And we know Saitama is not normal. His biological function is completely different to that of a normal human being. Yeah, I mean, we've seen him fight and survive in space with his fight against Garo, proving that he really doesn't need oxygen to survive. Now, when he was sent to the moon against Boris, we saw that Saitama actually couldn't breathe, but this is a bit of a contradiction, as later we see the opposite. So how can we explain this? Because it could very well affect the Death Note's ability to kill the One Punch Man. Well, we all know that Saitama's true power is the ability to adapt and overcome and exceed his own limits. I mean, thanks to his training regimen that overcame the normal ability for a human, he broke his limiter. That's right, his ability to grow is insane and is clearly demonstrated within the fight against Garo. So is that the answer? Saitama simply just adapted his body to no longer need oxygen, which allows him to fight in space? It is a viable theory, and let's say it's true for now. With this assumption, Saitama wouldn't really die from a heart attack as his body doesn't even need oxygen. So is that it? Case closed? The death note fails? Well, not quite. If you're still following what I'm saying, I commend you, because it's about to get a whole lot more complex. The death note is a tool that brings death. I mean, we know that much, and death can come through several means, and is the cause of the death itself. This is important as heart attack victims usually have causes for their heart attacks within their body and their biological functions, but the death note in its universe is the cause for the heart attack. You still follow what I'm saying? This may suggest, and I know this might sound crazy, it can imply that the death note has the power to change human biology to allow the death to occur. Okay, now that I say that, it seems obvious. I mean, how else would they get the heart attacks? That is pretty much how the deaths are even occurring. So is this an answer to our question? I mean, does the death note have the ability to change Saitama's biology to force his death? I mean, it is an argument you may consider and it seems viable as far as we know, other than the fact that Saitama will probably resist, which honestly seems like the most logical conclusion, thanks to the whole point of Saitama's character being immune to such hacks. I mean, we see this with Guri Gunshoop and his gravity manipulation on Boris' ship, but I want to dive into more detail rather than just having the answer of him being a parody character that can resist anything. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, there is one rule that I haven't considered yet and I haven't told you guys about yet, and it could very well determine the answer for us. I'll read it out to you guys. It says, the conditions of the death will not be realized unless they are physically possible for that human or could be reasonably assumed to be carried out. Now, some of you may think this just means the place of death, as the Death Note universe gave this as an example itself, where a human cannot travel all the way to Paris from Japan in a short time frame. I thought this too, but the rule doesn't really mention this to be the sole case where it applies. I mean, even after, there's another outline for the use of the Death Note that helps us understand what it means by physically possible. It reads as follows: suicide is a universally valid cause of death, as all humans are thought to possess the potential to commit suicide. It is therefore something that is reasonably assumed of an individual. Okay, this changes things quite a bit. Saitama, as we know, cannot be killed by anything, even himself. So in the words of the Death Note itself, death cannot be reasonably assumed of this particular individual. So there we go. This rule itself kind of determines it in my opinion. It confirms that the Death Note simply provides a means to death rather than the death itself, as the means must be reasonable and a valid cause of death. I mean, if the Death Note could provide death regardless of the means, this rule simply wouldn't exist, other than the cases where the human must be controlled, as it advises that it must be a valid cause of death that is reasonable for that individual, and Saitama does not really have any valid cause of death as far as we know. Even chucking him out to the void of space doesn't affect his body. So after all the possible forms of discussion we've had, I think I came up with an answer that I'm pretty confident in. I mean, such a rule would mean that there must be a way to reasonably kill Saitama written down into the Death Note in order to kill him. And a heart attack isn't really it, nor is any other way that Light or any Death Note user can probably think of. And that's also considering that they have his name or the Shinigami eyes to get it. So yeah, what do you guys think of this matchup? The Death Note is a supernatural book, but it seems that it does need the condition of his death to be valid. So I'm pretty confident on this. Ultimately, the nonchalant guy that we all know and love survives the supernatural book. But hey, it's just a theory, so go ahead and leave your thoughts down in the comments below. Do you think he survives or dies? I mean, he's still a human, right?